When I approached the chief's desk, he looked at me carefully and, without waiting for me to say something, simply said, "Jackson, you look terrible. Go home before you infect everyone here." I didn't feel well, my head was buzzing, my throat was sore, and my body felt heavy, like lead. But it wasn't the first week that someone in the office got sick. I didn't argue. Getting up from my seat, I took my laptop and said goodbye to my colleagues, promising to return in a couple of days when I feel better. I was sure that Lauren, my beloved wife, would be at home. She had a free day, and I thought she could take care of me, as she always did. Maybe she'll even make her signature chicken soup, which used to make me feel better. When I drove up to our house, the street was deserted, but there was an unfamiliar green pickup truck in the driveway. I slowed down, trying to figure out who could come to visit us. Lauren didn't mention any plans for the day. Maybe the neighbor left the car, I thought, shrugging my shoulders. I parked at the curb and got out of the car. My head was still buzzing, but now that noise had been replaced by some kind of unpleasant, disturbing hum. I entered the house through the garage. Lauren usually left the music on in the kitchen or talked on the phone. But it was too quiet today. But suddenly I heard it. Quiet, muffled sounds coming from the depths of the house. I stopped halfway to the living room, listening. It could have been anything. TV, radio, maybe Lauren was talking to someone. But the longer I listened, the more clearly it became that these sounds were not a conversation. They were moans. Moans of pleasure. I took a step towards the hallway leading to the bedroom, and my fear began to turn into horror. I reached the door, which was ajar a couple of inches. I saw them outside the door. And a terrible scene appeared before me, as if torn from the deepest layers of the subconscious. On our bed, which has always been a place of comfort and safety, I saw Lauren. She was on all fours, her hair falling over her shoulders, mixing with the soft folds of the sheet. Lauren was trapped in this position, her head sank into the pillows. There was a man standing behind her. He was tall and muscular, his body glistening with sweat, reflecting an unnatural light that seemed to come from nowhere. His long dark hair was plastered to his face. There was a fierce grace in his movements, like a predator attacking its prey, and there was something monstrous about it. They moved together as if in a terrible dance, their bodies merging into one rhythmic wave that seemed to capture the entire space of the room. Each thrust of the stranger was like a hammer hitting an anvil, and with each movement Lauren let out loud moans full of pleasure. My feet seemed rooted to the floor, and I couldn't move, as if I was chained to this place by invisible chains. The sound of her moaning was so sharp, so penetrating, that it seemed to cut through the very space around us. I could see her back arching under each of his blows, her fingers gripping the sheets, leaving marks. There was a thick, almost palpable tension in the air. Every inch of the room was saturated with a heavy smell of sweat and passion, but it was not the passion that unites, but the one that destroys. I felt a wave of horror rising inside me, mixed with a feeling of complete powerlessness. This scene seemed to last forever, every moment stretched out as if time had slowed down, allowing me to feel the full weight of what was happening. I wanted to scream, to rush to them, to stop this nightmare, but no sound came out of my throat, and my body refused to obey. All I could do was watch Lauren, my Lauren, become part of this nightmare that my house had become. My hands were shaking as I reached for the phone. I didn't know what to do, I didn't know how to react to it, and maybe I was acting on automatic. I turned on the camera and took some pictures. Proof that I'm not crazy, that this is happening in reality. I took a step back and the door creaked slightly. Lauren jerked her head up and turned around. There was something like panic in her eyes, but it was too late. I met her gaze. This was not the Lauren I knew, not the woman who promised to be with me for better or worse. She looked strange, somehow unfamiliar. She said my name, but it didn't matter anymore. Without saying a word, I turned around and walked away. I couldn't breathe, I couldn't think. All I felt was the need to get out of here as soon as possible. I rushed out into the street, where fresh air gushed out, hitting me in the face like a slap in the face. I walked over to my SUV, but before getting into the car, my gaze fell back on the green pickup truck. Anger flared up inside me like a flame, and without hesitation, I took a screwdriver from the toolbox that stood at the entrance to the garage. I quickly walked over to the pickup and drove the screwdriver into all four wheels with all my might. The air hissed out of the tires. It was like a surge of relief, a brief sense of control in the chaos that engulfed me. Having completed my little revenge, I threw the screwdriver on the ground and got into the car. The engine started with a sharp growl, and I took off, leaving the house behind. There were no thoughts in my head, just a deafening hum. I drove, not knowing where I was going, until I realized that I was just trying to escape from the reality that seemed stable and unchangeable to me a few hours ago. I drove without taking apart the road, just to get away from home, where my whole life collapsed in a few moments. Headache and fever mixed with hatred and the pain of betrayal. I could feel my body getting heavier, and even my hands clasped on the steering wheel were starting to shake with fatigue. I realized that I couldn't continue in this state. Something had to be done. The first thing I decided to do was go to the pharmacy. I found a nearby store with a bright neon cross that sparkled in the evening twilight. After parking at the entrance, I got out of the car, feeling my legs give way treacherously. But I forced myself to move on. Inside the pharmacy there was a smell of something chemical mixed with the aroma of cleaning products and medicines. I walked over to the counter where the pharmacist, an elderly woman with thick glasses, was staring at the computer screen. I had to cough to get her attention. "How can I help you?" Her voice was polite, but there was a weariness in it, as if she had been here all day. "I need something for the flu," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The woman looked at me carefully, noticing my pale appearance, then nodded and began to take out various packages from the drawers. "Do you have a fever? A headache?" "What is it?" she asked, looking at me over the top of her glasses. "Yes, and also a body ache." "I need something for the pain too," I added, feeling the fatigue coming on with renewed vigor. She handed me several boxes of medicines and a small bottle of liquid, explaining how to take them. I listened to her with half an ear, thinking about what to do next. After all, medicines are only a temporary solution. I had to figure out how to deal with what I had just seen. After paying for my purchases, I left the pharmacy and went to the car. The cold air hit my face, and for a few moments it helped clear my head. But as soon as I got behind the wheel, I felt everything inside shrink again. I couldn't just sit here and agonize over Lauren's betrayal. I knew there was one place I could go to be alone with my thoughts, a small motel on the outskirts of town. Lauren and I used to stay there when we first came here. Since then, this place has been a symbol of solitude and tranquility for me, which I desperately needed now. I headed there, trying not to think about what had happened. I stopped at the entrance to the motel, got out and went inside. A young guy with a lazy expression was sitting at the counter, immersed in the screen of his phone. I went up to him and asked for a room for one night. The guy lazily handed me the key without asking any questions, and I headed towards my temporary shelter. The room was simple but clean. Inside, it smelled of cheap air freshener and a slightly musty carpet. I sat down on the bed and, closing my eyes for a moment, felt a wave of fatigue coming with renewed force. But I knew I couldn't relax. Opening the medicine bottle, I quickly drank its contents, washed down with pills that I was given at the pharmacy. My head cleared up a bit, but thoughts of Lauren and that man continued to torment me. But instead of sinking into self-pity, I started thinking about the next step. I couldn't just walk away and leave everything as it is. I needed to know more, I needed to act. But how? The answer came unexpectedly. I took out my phone and, despite my trembling hands, dialed the number of the lawyer, Grace Shaw. I didn't know her personally, but I had heard about her reputation. Ruthless, accurate, and always on the client's side. That's what I needed. "Grace Shaw, I'm listening." Her voice sounded clear and confident as she answered. "This is Jackson Moore," I said, feeling my inner tension give way to a strange sense of determination. "I need to discuss a case urgently." "Of course, Mr. Moore. When can you meet?" Her professionalism was noticeable even through the phone. "As soon as possible," I replied, feeling my heart begin to beat faster. "Tonight. I understand the situation is serious. Come back in an hour, I'll be waiting for you in my office," she said. I thanked her and hung up, feeling a strange sense of calm creep in. I have a plan. My life might be ruined, but I wasn't going to just sit back. I was determined to take control. After taking a shower to freshen up a little and wash off the remnants of the day, I changed into clean clothes and left the room. Internal tension mixed with a cold decision to act. I was no longer someone who was willing to tolerate and forgive. Lauren's betrayal became a point of no return. By the time I arrived at Grace Shaw's office, the evening had already begun. I walked through the hall of the old building, feeling the footsteps echo in the empty corridor. Grace's office was illuminated by the dim light of a desk lamp, which gave the entire room a soft but austere look. Grace was sitting at her desk with several business folders in front of her. She looked up and immediately saw in me a person who was very worried about something. Without further ado, she motioned for me to sit down. "Tell me what happened, Mr. Moore." Her voice was stern, but at the same time enveloping. I told her everything. About how he caught Lauren with another man, about how he couldn't contain his anger and left the house. I told them everything that had overwhelmed me from the moment I saw them together. Grace listened in silence, writing something down in her notebook. When I finished, she was silent for a while, thinking about what she had heard. Then she looked at me with the determination I was so desperately looking for. "We can start with a 90-day separation," she began, putting down her pen. "This will give you time to think about your actions. But if you have already made up your mind, we can start the divorce process right now. You need to decide what you want." I knew Grace was right. There is no room for doubt in my life. I made a choice that I should have made a long time ago. "Let's start with separation," I said, feeling every muscle in my body tense with determination. "But be prepared for a divorce. I don't want to be associated with this betrayal anymore." Grace nodded and began to draw up the necessary documents. I sat watching her work, feeling a strange sense of liberation grow inside me. I didn't know what lay ahead, but one thing was clear: I would no longer be the Jackson who endured. Now I was ready to fight for my freedom. When the documents were ready, I signed them, feeling like this act was completely changing my life. Now I had a plan. I went back to the motel, where I took a few more pills and tried to fall asleep. My sleep was restless, full of disturbing images and fragments of memories, but I knew that in the morning I would wake up with renewed vigor. The morning brought some clarity. I decided to go to the city, just to keep myself busy. I probably needed to buy something, even if it was just an illusion that I was still in control of my life. When I parked at the supermarket, which I hadn't been to for many years, memories came flooding back to me. It was here that Lauren and I made our first purchases together when we first started dating. Now it seemed far away, as if from another life. I wandered around the shops without having a clear plan. It all seemed so pointless, but I kept moving like an automaton, just so I wouldn't stand still. But suddenly something interrupted this automatism. "Jackson." A familiar female voice sounded behind me. I froze, trying to find in my memory that voice that seemed familiar to me, but still far away. I turned around and saw her. Emily Sanders, an old friend of mine from school. We used to be close friends, but life took us on different paths, and I didn't expect to meet her here. Emily hasn't changed much since the last time I saw her. She still had the same warm brown eyes and easy smile that always made me feel comfortable in her company. But there was something new in her eyes, something I couldn't immediately understand. "Emily," I said, unable to hide the surprise in my voice. I didn't expect to see you here." "And I didn't expect to see you," she replied, her voice soft but with a note of hidden sadness. "How are you?" This simple question made me stop and think. How am I? What could I say to that? "I'm going through a bad period," I replied, trying to stay calm. "And you? What brings you here?" Emily smiled, but there was sadness in her smile. "I recently returned to the city," she said, her voice getting a little louder. "After the divorce, I decided to return to my parents. I feel safer here, I guess." We exchanged a couple more meaningless phrases, but something new, elusive, but real, was already beginning to form between us. I felt that this meeting was not accidental. We talked like old friends, but in every word she said, in every look, I felt some kind of meaning, as if she was trying to say something, but did not dare. "Do you mind meeting later?" Emily asked when we were almost done talking. "Just to chat, maybe, about how life has changed us both." I didn't know what to say to that. On the one hand, I was still preoccupied with my own problems. On the other hand, it seemed to me that this meeting could help me find answers to questions that I didn't even know how to ask. "Yes, of course," I said, feeling something inside me begin to change. "With pleasure." We agreed to meet at her house in the evening, and I suddenly felt that I had to see her again. Perhaps because she, like me, was going through something similar. In the evening, I went to Emily. She was already waiting for me, and when I entered, She smiled the same warm, but a little sad smile. We sat for a long time in her cozy kitchen, immersed in a conversation that was becoming more and more personal. Every new story, every detail of Emily's life revealed a new side to her, and I began to realize that this woman sitting across from me was much more than just an old acquaintance. She was someone who could understand, support, and help me find a new path. Time flew by unnoticed, and suddenly I realized that it had long been dark outside the windows. "Why don't you stay for dinner?" Emily suggested. Her voice was low, but there was a warm sincerity in it. "That would be great," I replied, and she smiled, nodding slightly. We cooked dinner together, talking about what is so important in life, but we were often silent, and this silence was surprisingly cozy. When dinner was ready, we sat down at the table, and only the sound of our appliances could be heard in the silence of the room. But even that silence wasn't awkward, it said more than any words. When dinner came to an end, I realized that I didn't want to leave. And she seemed to feel the same way. "Why don't you stay?" "What is it?" she finally asked, her voice barely audible, but there was a tenderness in it that I hadn't known for so long. I looked at her and saw something in her eyes that made me believe it was the right thing to do. Nodding, I got up from the table and walked over to her. Emily stood up too, and I gently took her hand, feeling an invisible connection between us. We walked up the stairs to her bedroom in silence. Everything here spoke of her, and I understood that it was in such places that she found her peace. She came closer to me, her eyes glittering from the soft light, and I felt our breaths merge together. I gently hugged her, feeling her body gently pull towards me. Her hands slid down my back, and I felt her breathing become a little more rapid. "I'm glad you're here," she whispered, and her voice was as soft as silk. I didn't answer, but there was enough in my actions to show how I felt the same way. Our lips met in a gentle kiss, and at that moment I realized that here and now, in this house, I had found what I had been looking for so long. The kiss deepened, and I felt the passion between us begin to grow, which was sincere and natural. Emily slowly led me to the bed, and together we sat down on the soft coverlet. She looked at me with the same tenderness that made me feel for the first time that I could trust again. I ran my hands over her body, feeling her skin react to my touch. She hugged me gently, and I could feel her heart beating in time with mine. We were together, merged into one in this secluded space where nothing existed but the two of us. The night passed like one long moment, full of tenderness and discoveries. We took our time, enjoying every moment. When we finally fell asleep, I felt like this time it was for real. In the morning, I woke up to the light touch of her hand. Emily was already awake. She was lying next to me, watching me with a warm smile on her face. "You know, Jackson," she said after a long pause, "sometimes life throws us such trials that seem unbearable. But it is at such moments that we can find ourselves anew." Her words penetrated deep into my heart. And at that moment, I realized that this meeting was not just an accident. Emily became for me the person who helped me not to drown in my problems, and I began to understand that there is always a second chance in life. But this time I knew that starting a new relationship without solving the problem with my wife would be another mistake. Returning home was an ordeal that could not be avoided. I knew this day would come, but I had no idea how hard it would be to meet my wife Lauren face to face after everything that had happened. The night behind the wheel was long, my thoughts were confused, and every mile that brought me closer to home added a stone to my chest. When I parked the car, the first thing I noticed was the unusual order. I entered the house and heard her footsteps. She came out of the kitchen, wiping tears from her face, and rushed to me, as if clutching at the last hope. "Jackson!" Her voice trembled as she said my name. She couldn't hold back the tears, and I could see fear and despair in her eyes. "I'm so glad you're back. We can fix this, I know. Please give me a chance." I stood in front of her, hardly knowing how to react. Her tears and despair looked sincere, but I knew it wouldn't change what I saw. The memories of that day flashed before my eyes, and I felt the rage boiling up inside me again. "Lauren," I began, trying to stay calm, although my voice was trembling treacherously, "I can't forgive what you did. You ruined everything we had." She rushed towards me, grabbing the sleeves of my jacket as if this was her last chance to hold me back. "I made a mistake, a huge mistake." Her voice was full of pleading. "But I love you, Jackson. Please don't leave. We can fix this, I know we can. I was stupid, She couldn't finish, the words stuck in her throat, and tears streamed down her cheeks. But I couldn't look at her with the same eyes anymore. What she did destroyed both of us, and as much as I wanted to believe her words, I knew I could never forget. "Lauren," I said, carefully freeing my hands from her grasp, "you've made your choice. And now I'm making mine. I can't stay. I can't live with the fact that you betrayed me." Her eyes widened in horror when she realized that my words were final. She tried to hold me back, her hands flailing as if she was looking for a way to turn back time, but it was useless. "Please don't go," she fell to her knees in front of me, her voice hoarse with despair. "We can start all over again. I'll do everything as you want. Just don't leave me." Every word she said was like a knife in my heart, but I knew I couldn't stay. If I stay, this house will become a prison for both of us, full of memories of things that will never be fixed. I wasn't ready to live in the shadow of her infidelity. "Lauren, this doesn't make sense," I said, feeling my chest tighten with pain. "I can't forget what I saw. I won't be able to trust you again." I looked away because I couldn't stand her suffering face anymore. I had to leave to save myself, and maybe give her a chance to start over. I turned around and headed for the exit. Lauren tried to grab my arm, but I gently pushed her away. "Goodbye, Lauren," I said, opening the door. "No." Her cry was filled with despair. "Jackson, please, I love you, I'll do anything, just stay." But I've already made my choice. I left the house, leaving her there, with her tears and pleas. My soul was torn apart, but I knew that this step was necessary. If I had stayed, I would have only made our pain worse. I got into the car and started the engine. Lauren was still standing at the door, her face contorted with grief, and for a moment I almost gave up. But then the memories of that day came flooding back to me, and I firmly pressed down on the gas pedal. I left without looking back. I didn't know what I was going to do next. All I knew was that I needed to leave. I went to my office, where I had to finish my business before I left. My colleagues already knew about my decision to resign. They greeted me with respect, but I could see them looking at each other, sensing that something was wrong. I was more than just a colleague to them, but I couldn't open up. My last day at work was a blur. I signed documents, talked with my superiors and subordinates, and accepted congratulations and wishes. But there was a storm raging inside me. I knew that I was leaving not only my job, but also the life I had been building all these years. When the working day was over, I packed up my things and headed for the exit. In the hallway, I met Marcy, my longtime colleague, who has always been a friend to me. She stopped me, her eyes were full of questions, but she didn't say anything. Instead, she hugged me, and that was the last straw for me. I felt tears starting to come to my eyes, but I forced myself to hold them back. "Good luck, Jackson," she said softly, and I nodded, unable to say anything in response. When I went outside, the evening air seemed especially fresh to me. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, trying to come to terms with the fact that I was free now. But freedom turned out to be much harder than I expected. The night brought a restless sleep. I saw Lauren in my dreams, heard her pleading and screaming, but every time I turned away and left. When I woke up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat, I realized that I had to change something. The life I was living no longer existed, and now I had to find a new path. My footsteps took me to Emily Sanders' house. I didn't know why I came here, but something inside me told me that this was the right decision. She opened the door when she saw me, and there was so much understanding in her eyes that I felt the oppressive weight that I was carrying with me loosen a little. Her voice was soft and soothing. "What happened?" I looked at her and felt the words start to come out of my mouth. I told her everything, about Lauren, how I left her, my decision to quit my job, and how I lost my direction. Emily listened in silence, her eyes full of sympathy, but she did not interrupt, did not condemn. When I finished, she invited me in. We sat in her kitchen, drank coffee and talked about life. I felt calmer in her presence than I had in the last few days. At that moment, I realized that maybe this was my new path. Not alone, not in the shadow of the past, but with someone who was ready to share this burden with me.